Ever wondered how scandalous one's life needs to be remembered for over 2,000 years? Well, meet Diogenes, the poster child for ancient Greek scandals. Now, before you start imagining Diogenes as some sort of ancient Greek rock star, let's get one thing straight. He was a philosopher. But oh boy, not the boring, beard-stroking, contemplating the meaning of life kind of philosopher. No. Diogenes was more like the life of the party. If the party was in a barrel. Yeah, you heard it right. Our man D preferred the company of stray dogs and the cozy confines of a barrel to the marble columns and lofty ideas of Athenian society. He was the original minimalist, way before it was a cool hashtag on Instagram. In fact, if he was around today, he'd probably be living in a tiny house, disrespecting authorities on Twitter and eating out of dumpsters. For philosophy, of course. Now, you might be thinking, well, that's odd, but it doesn't sound too scandalous. Hold your horses, we're just scratching the surface of the barrel here. Diogenes was notorious for his outrageous behavior. He had no qualms about, let's say, relieving himself in public or expressing his love for himself in public. He was the embodiment of zero given before it became a meme. But don't get the wrong idea. He wasn't just a rogue philosopher. Diogenes had some deep thoughts too. His lifestyle was a radical statement against artificiality, pretentiousness, and materialism. He was basically saying, hey, look at me, I'm living in a barrel, and I'm happier than all of you in your fancy houses. He even once told Alexander the Great, arguably the most powerful man in the world at the time, to step aside because he was blocking his sunlight. Talk about guts. So buckle up, folks, because we're about to dive into the barrel of Diogenes' life. It's deeper and murkier than it looks. Ever thought your studio apartment was too cramped? Well, Diogenes made a wine barrel his home sweet home. Talk about minimalistic living. You know that guy in your neighborhood, the one who's always doing something a little out there, like growing a garden on his roof or walking his pet iguana? Yeah, Diogenes was that guy, but in ancient Greece. Except his rooftop garden was a ceramic jar, and his pet iguana was a philosophy of life that made him the original hipster. Diogenes was the poster child for nonconformity. He was a philosopher, sure, but he was also a trendsetter. He rejected societal norms and materialistic desires, opting to live in a large ceramic jar, or as some would say, a wine barrel. He was basically the first person to say, hey, who needs a penthouse when you can have a pottery house? Now, this wasn't some fancy schmancy designer barrel. No, sir. It was your run-of-the-mill garden variety barrel. Nothing more than a humble abode for our philosopher friend. And you thought your IKEA furniture was minimalist. Diogenes' barrel living was more than just a statement against the materialistic society. It was his way of embracing simplicity and freedom. He was the original Marie Kondo, finding joy not in things, but in the absence of them. His philosophy was called Cynicism, not to be confused with the eye-rolling, sarcastic cynicism we know today. Diogenes' cynicism was about living in harmony with nature, rejecting false values, and yes, living in barrels. Diogenes, with his barrel and his philosophy, was like that one friend who's always pushing you to go camping. But instead of a weekend, it's forever. And instead of a tent, it's a barrel. So the next time you're feeling a bit cramped in your apartment, or you're stressing about the latest IKEA catalog, remember Diogenes. He was a man who found freedom in a pottery shack, who embraced the bare essentials and made a wine barrel his castle. And you thought the tiny house movement was a new trend. Diogenes was centuries ahead, literally living in a jar. Feeling rebellious against authority? Diogenes sure did when he told Alexander the Great to move aside because he was blocking his sunlight. Talk about audacity. The man he was speaking to wasn't just any ordinary king, but Alexander the Great, the mighty warrior who had managed to take over half the known world by the time he was just 30. Diogenes, however, couldn't care less. He was sunbathing and Alexander was merely in the way. If you're thinking, wow, that's daring, then brace yourself because Diogenes was just warming up. The actual encounter went like this. When Alexander asked Diogenes if there was anything he could do to assist him, Diogenes, without hesitation, told him to stop blocking his sunlight. To everyone's surprise, Alexander wasn't offended. He was actually impressed, stating, "If I were not Alexander, I would wish to be Diogenes." But the real kicker came when Diogenes replied that if he weren't Diogenes, he'd wish to be Diogenes too. He didn't only tell a king to move aside, he also lived his life with an audaciousness that was inherently scandalous and shocking. He was completely unafraid. Diogenes was famous for his public antics, which were, to put it mildly, unconventional. He deliberately chose to defy societal norms, not for social media validation, but simply because he didn't care for the opinions of others. His philosophy was straightforward. He believed in living naturally, in sync with the world, and free from the constraints of man-made rules and social standards. He was the original revolutionary, the first punk, the ancient world's version of Banksy. His canvas, however, wasn't a wall. It was society itself. Ever felt like breaking the rules? Diogenes was a master at it. Diogenes was not just another philosopher. He was audacity personified, the kind who'd make societal normies squirm. One fine example was his audacious act of eating in the marketplace. While society frowned upon public eating, Diogenes was unabashed. He would casually enjoy his meals amidst the bustling crowd, turning societal norms on their head. And it didn't stop there. His lively spirit went further. He believed when nature calls, answer it. Regardless of his urination was his way of defying contemporary standards, marking his territory with nonchalance. But perhaps his most carefree move was his acts of physical self-love in public. He lived life his way, a spectacle of rebellion. So if you're ever feeling rebellious, just channel your inner Diogenes. Tired of the same old knock-knock jokes? Try some Diogenes humor. It's ancient but still gold. Now, Diogenes wasn't your typical stand-up comedian. He didn't have a mic, a stage, or even a pair of shoes. But he did have wit sharper than a Spartan spear, and a sense of humor as dry as the Athenian desert. One of his most famous quips came when he was asked why he was carrying a lantern in the middle of the day. Diogenes, ever the philosophical prankster, replied, "I am just looking for an honest man." Now, we all know he wasn't literally looking for an honest man, but rather making a sharp commentary on the moral bankruptcy of his contemporaries. Talk about a savage burn, centuries before Twitter was even a thing. And remember the time when Plato defined a man as a featherless biped. Diogenes, always ready for a good roast, plucked a chicken and brought it to Plato's academy, declaring, "Behold, I've brought you a man." The academy was left in stitches, and Plato had to revise his definition. Now, these may not get you a Netflix comedy special, but they sure do make you appreciate the spirit and biting wit of this ancient philosopher. Diogenes didn't just crack wise, he used humor as a tool to expose the absurdities and hypocrisies of his time. So there you have it, folks, a life full of scandal, sarcasm, and a whole lot of barrel dwelling. That's Diogenes for you. If there's one thing we can learn from Diogenes, it's that sometimes we just need to care less. This ancient philosopher lived his life unapologetically, challenging societal norms and expectations at every turn. Diogenes' radical philosophy is a stark reminder to not sweat the small stuff, to live authentically, just like him. He spent his days lounging in a barrel, shamelessly begging for food, and even relieving himself in public. Now, we're not suggesting you start living in a barrel or quit your job to become a full-time cynic. But there's something to be said about Diogenes' carefree attitude and his ability to shrug off the pressures of societal norms. His life was a testament to living authentically, embracing who you are, and not being afraid to stand out or be different. His teachings remind us that sometimes the key to true happiness lies not in conforming, but in breaking free from the chains of expectation. In the end, it's about living your truth, no matter how unconventional it may seem. So, if you're feeling bogged down by societal pressures or expectations, just remember Diogenes and his barrel. And remember, it's okay to care less about what others think and more about what makes you happy. If you enjoyed this scandalous, juicy gossip, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Until next time, keep it scandalous, folks.